Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting a few more seconds. This is Geopolitics, Diplomacy, and Peacemaking with Telos and Ambassador Martin Indyk. We'll begin in just a moment. We're so glad all of you are here. Actually, we'll start right now, and I will introduce the call, Telos, and our esteemed guest. So welcome again to all of you from a snowy New York. It feels like it's a snowy world today. It was snowing in Israel, Palestine, and even here down in Texas. As most of you know, I'm Khalil with Telos. I'd love to thank my colleagues David and Sharon, and then also Ambassador Indyk's colleague Basia for setting this important conversation up today. If you're new to Telos, what we do is we form communities of American peacemakers to reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. One of our main issue areas historically has been, and today is, America's relationship to Israel-Palestine. There, we promote an approach we call pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. As I mentioned today, we're really honored to be able to have a significant conversation with one of America's most prominent diplomats and Middle East experts, Ambassador Martin Indyk. We also have a diverse set of callers, which I'm excited about. We have a very broad network here at Telos, conservative and liberal pastors, philanthropists, even some folks from Israel and Palestine are joining us today. The way the call will work is Ambassador Indyk and I will have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll start taking audience questions. Please put those in the chat, and I'll try to incorporate as many of those as I can in the remaining time. We're going to jump right in just a moment, but a few words about Ambassador Indyk. Few people have his understanding of American involvement policy in the region. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Israel and President Barack Obama's Special Envoy on Middle East Peace. He's now a distinguished fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And maybe perhaps, Ambassador, that might mean you'll be able to give us a little bit more insight than if you had an official role still in the current administration. But regardless, I want to highlight why Telos feels this conversation is so critically important now. And there are two reasons. First, sometimes when we speak about peacemaking, we either reduce it to an exalted diplomatic practice, the kind that Ambassador Indyk has spent a career shaping or leading. Or alternatively, I think it's really common for us to reduce it to something interpersonal. Yet these sorts of complex issues like conflict in the Middle East or deep inequities here at home necessarily have a policy and a political component to them. Government and politics are how we deploy our shared resources, financial, political, military. Nothing has as much direct impact on lives, on the prospect for peace or for war, as the practices of politics and diplomacy. So anyone who's serious about engaging these really stuck and difficult issues needs to have at least a basic understanding of the larger dynamics at play, even if your focus is on the personal and the community level, which is just as important. And as you know at Telos, we do not devalue that. We think it's a both and. But second, it's important to have this conversation now because we have a new presidential administration. President Biden has indicated that his foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, will differ considerably from that of his predecessor, President Trump. So we're not here to debate Ambassador Indyk, but rather to learn just how might U.S. Middle East policy under President Biden shift. We're invested in this conversation because it might help those of us who are active on these issues better steward our limited energies and our resources in the coming years. So with all that said, why don't we start there, Ambassador? Let's zoom out and get some context before we zoom into Israel-Palestine. How does the Middle East generally fit into what President Biden has termed his reimagine of U.S. foreign policy more broadly?
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm grateful to Greg for inviting me. Again, this relationship goes back many years to San Francisco. Maybe you can figure out how many years, Greg, but I'm delighted to see that Telos is thriving. Then it was just an idea in Greg's mind. So it's great to see how the organization has grown even during this pandemic. In terms of the wider context, I think it's very important to understand that Joe Biden is not Barack Obama 2.0, even though many of the people that are involved in foreign policy and Middle East policy are from the Obama administration. Their involvement now comes from their relationship with Joe Biden rather than Barack Obama. Many of them work directly with them. Tony Blinken is the most obvious example where he's worked with him from his Senate days in the Foreign Relations Committee all the way through the Obama administration. And Joe Biden himself has developed his views, I would say very strong views, about American foreign policy over 35 years of government service, most of them in the Senate, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which he chaired for a long time, and then, of course, subsequently as vice president to Barack Obama. But he's a seasoned foreign policy hand who has some very clear ideas about the world and America's role in it. Just as an aside, I've just put to bed an 8-year effort to write a book on Henry Kissinger's Middle East diplomacy. It'll be coming out later this year. And one of the things I noted there was that there needed to be, at the end of the second Israel-Egypt negotiations, which Kissinger brought to an agreement, the Sinai II agreement, it required the placement of American technicians, about 100 of them, in the Sinai to observe the activities of the armies of both sides. We're talking about 1975. And that had to be approved by the Senate. And it took 6 weeks to get the approval, even though it was overwhelmingly approved. The opposition was led by 2 senators. One, Mike Mansfield, the storied head of the Democratic Party in the Senate, and the other, one freshman senator named Joe Biden. And what was his reason for opposing the technicians in Sinai in the context of a peace agreement, not a peace agreement, but a disengagement agreement between Israel and Egypt? He was opposed to foreign entanglements. And I think as it was then, as it is today, that's a fundamental instinct of Joe Biden's. And it will apply to the Middle East in a way that will actually lead to some continuity from Obama to Trump to Biden of wanting to reduce America's military footprint in the region. But that is part of a broader approach to the world in which Joe Biden very much intends to reduce the Middle East as a priority in his foreign policy. And I think it's very important to understand that. The delay in making phone calls to Middle Eastern leaders for almost 4 weeks, when he called just about every other leader in the world, was purposely designed to send a clear signal, not to Netanyahu, or at least not to him alone, but to all of them, that they don't come first anymore in Biden's foreign policy. Instead, the focus will be on climate change and global issues like pandemics and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and China. China as a rising power in Asia that he intends to collaborate with where he can, but to contain and, even if necessary, confront. Those are his essential priorities. As part of that, he wants to rebuild alliances that were badly damaged during the Trump era. But when it comes to the Middle East, what is most interesting and I would say emblematic is that Joe Biden traveled to the State Department to give his first foreign policy speech as president. And he announced a special envoy, a special Middle Eastern envoy, not for Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, but for Yemen, for ending the war in Yemen. Now, if you're looking at the Middle East from a kind of traditional American foreign policy standpoint or from a realist standpoint of where our interests lie, Yemen, ending the war in Yemen would not be top of the list. Why is it on the top of his list when it comes to the Middle East? And that's the other, I think, dimension of Biden's approach to foreign policy, which is that he very much believes in putting values back into America's foreign policy. The values that he feels very strongly that America stands for: democracy, freedom, human rights. And America being a positive force for ending conflicts, not fueling them, and certainly not starting them if they can be avoided. And so that's why the special envoy for Yemen. That's why he has announced as one of his first moves, ending all support for Saudi Arabia's involvement in the war in Yemen. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, Saudi Arabia can't fight a war in Yemen without American support. And it's a very clear signal, which has been delivered to them privately, that he wants them out of Yemen, period. And he will support Saudi Arabia's legitimate defense needs, particularly in the face of potential continuation of Houthi attacks on Saudi soil with rockets and drones, which they've been doing fairly regularly. But he will support increasing Saudi Arabia's defensive capability to protect against that threat, but not Saudi Arabia's engagement in Yemen and its offensive capacities there. He's put all of Saudi Arabia's arms sales on hold, not just the ones to Yemen, to support the war in Yemen.
Right.
And that's part of what his spokesman has now called a recalibration of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the history, Saudi Arabia has long been, since the end of the Second World War, seen as a vital strategic partner of the United States. And for him to be holding up arms to Saudi Arabia and talking from the get-go about recalibrating the relationship is all about values in his foreign policy. He wants to send a signal to Saudi Arabia, particularly to the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. It's a different game now. Party's over. No blank checks. I'm going to judge you by the way you treat your people. And if you continue your thuggish behavior, that is going to impact on my relationship with you. And just to make it absolutely clear, there'll be no phone call to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Instead, as the White House spokesman said, he's going to be talking to his counterpart, the king, not the Crown Prince, which is also interesting because, unfortunately, the king is an old man, and as they say, the elevator doesn't quite go to the top floor. And so the conversation is going to be, let's say, somewhat limited. But he's doing that to send a signal to the Crown Prince that this is going to be an institutional relationship, not a relationship based on personalities. And he'll judge Saudi Arabia by the actions it takes, particularly towards its own people. That same equation will be applied in Egypt, where President Sisi has imposed a really oppressive regime on his people. And I think you will see that this is something that Biden cares about. Now we're talking about Egypt and Saudi Arabia, America's most important strategic partners in the Arab world. And
Right.
in both.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is such helpful framing and emphasizing sort of a recalibration of our relationship to our most significant Arab partners in the Middle East, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and doing that within a framework of Biden sort of trying to promote a values-driven US foreign policy focused on human rights, democracy, and non-entanglement. And so this raises a couple questions, obviously connected to Israel-Palestine, but before we get in there, there's one obvious question here that is just looming on the other side of the Gulf, and that's Iran. And Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have long opposed any sort of deal with Iran regarding nuclear non-proliferation. President Barack Obama obviously entered the JCPOA, or the Iran deal as it's called, as one of the capstone foreign policy achievements of both his administrations, which President Trump pulled out of. The Gulf states opposed that all the way through. Perhaps that's why one incentive for the Gulf states to sign the Abraham Accords just at the end of Trump's presidency had something to do with throwing a wrench and re-entering the Iran deal. That said, Biden was very clear that he wanted to get right back into the Iran deal once he became president, and that process seems to be stalled. Is there reevaluation of this? Is this connected to this new dynamic with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and the fact that he's standing up for Yemen? What's going on there with this values-driven approach before we jump to Israel-Palestine?
So what's going on with Iran is that other part of what I said in terms of the broader drivers of his foreign policy, which is his concern about preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction, and in particular his determination to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Iran is well on the path to acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. Trump having pulled out of the accord, they've stopped observing it, and they're now building up a capacity to enrich uranium to weapons grade, and developing ballistic missiles to deliver weapons. And the estimates are that it will take them somewhere around 4 months, if they continue on this trajectory, to acquire sufficient fissile material for a bomb, and probably another year after that to actually develop a deliverable weapon system. But the clock is ticking. And so he's keen to get Iran back into the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, with its restrictions on all of Iran's activities so as to prevent it from advancing towards a nuclear weapon. And then he wants to address some of the problems in the original deal and promote what his Secretary of State refers to as a longer and stronger deal. And what he means by that is to renegotiate some of the requirements there, in particular that relate to how long the agreement lasts, what's called the sunset clause, and what it covers, what happens to enrichment after the sunset clauses kick in, and what Iran does with its ballistic missile program and its activities, subversive activities across the region. So it's a pretty big agenda, but it starts with his desire to see Iran return to the agreement. And then he wants to negotiate these stronger requirements after that.
So you're hopeful that we're going to return back into the Iran deal relatively soon, though, with a slight renegotiation.
I think so. They haven't yet engaged with Iran. I think the Iranians are quite keen to do that. They want to get out from under sanctions. But the first thing they're doing is consulting with the Europeans and with their regional allies, Israel and the Arab states, to try to come up with a policy that they can all support before they go forward. But Biden has made clear that if the Iranians come back into full compliance, he will go back to the deal as well. And that will mean lifting all of the sanctions related to sale of oil and the financial sanctions. So there's anything between, depending on who's counting, between 15 billion and up to $75 billion that would flow into the Iranian coffers, the Iranian treasury very, very quickly once they're back in the deal. So they've got a very high incentive to come back into the deal. And so I think that is likely to happen, notwithstanding the internal politics in Iran. I still think that we will see that. How they negotiate beyond that is a mystery to me, and might well be a mystery to them at the moment.
Right. But as you point out, there are these strong incentives, and they were in the deal before. So to sum up, it feels like there is a recalibration of Biden's foreign policy generally. The Middle East, as I hear you saying, is not going to be a priority in the same way that it may have been in previous administrations, although both you and I know, having worked on these issues for years, sometimes people don't want to be involved in the Middle East, but it doesn't let them stay away.
Exactly. As you probably also know, it's good to have plans, but inevitably when they hit the reality, they need to be adjusted, and
Right.
And we'll see how that goes.
Well, that's a perfect transition to my next set of questions, if we might, to Israel-Palestine, because the reality there has not been static during the past decades or during the past 4 years, and what we've seen right now is sort of a real sort of devolution in the consensus that even a two-state solution is possible anymore. And this is among a variety of prominent voices. There was just a survey released this Tuesday, for example, in which a supermajority of Middle East experts just said two-state solution is no longer possible. It wasn't what they desired. And simultaneously, you have this new declaration from Beit Salem, which is one of Israel's most prominent human rights organizations, as you know, saying that the appropriate term for the situation on the ground with the Palestinians is apartheid. And so there's a real shift on the ground. And as you're talking about the Biden administration's foreign policy driven on non-entanglement and then freedom, democracy, human rights, it seems really complex in this place where we're very entangled, and this consensus that we've had for decades about how it should be resolved, which would need real US support to move forward, doesn't seem to be there in the same way anymore. So what do you think how is the Biden administration thinking about Israel-Palestine within the broader context of the Middle East, and then within sort of this values-driven approach where we clearly have some very serious human rights violations on the ground that are not currently being addressed?
It's a very good question. The answer requires a little bit of explanation in itself. As some of you may know, I was the special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in 2013 and 2014, which was the last time that there have been final status negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So that was, 7 years ago, going on 7 years, since there's been any engagement between Israeli and Palestinian officials on trying to resolve the conflict. And I came away from that negotiation believing that it would be a very long time before we got back to the table. And the reason for that is that, in my judgment, the parties were further apart on all of the core issues that would need to be resolved, further apart at the end of the negotiation than they were at the beginning. Now, you can blame that on me and John Kerry, But whoever's to blame, the reality is there. Joe Biden, as vice president, sat through all of our briefings and strategy sessions and reporting on the negotiations, sat by President Obama's side. He said nothing during those meetings. He would ask a question or something, but he never offered his opinion. But I know from subsequent conversations that he came away believing that as long as Netanyahu was Prime Minister of Israel and Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, was president of the Palestinian Authority, there would be no final status agreement. That these two leaders were incapable of convincing their people that their minimum requirements could be met through a negotiation. One, because he didn't want to convince them, and the other because he didn't have the ability to convince them. But it doesn't matter. The bottom line is still the same. Now, there are there are elections taking place in Israel on March 23rd, Palestinian Authority in May, including for the presidency. But as things look today, after we get through all of that, we'll still have Bibi Netanyahu and Abu Mazen as the leaders there. And if that's the case, Joe Biden, with the pandemic, the economic crisis, the climate change, China, the idea, Iran, as we discussed, the idea that he's going to invest his precious capital in an effort that he believes can lead nowhere in the political circumstances that now adhere means that that's why there's no special envoy. He's not going to invest the effort there. But that doesn't mean he's going to walk away from it. What it means is that he is convinced, and I agree with him on this, that a rebuilding is going to have to take place. Most importantly, a rebuilding of trust between the people on two sides. And many of you will be familiar with what I'm about to say, but it bears repeating, which is that even though people on both sides support a two-state solution, neither side believes that the other side is serious about it, that the other side intends to support a viable two-state solution that would provide Israelis with security and Palestinians with freedom, dignity, and contiguity.
And security as well.
And security as well, thank you, indeed. So, there's work to be done. And there's work to be done to try to rebuild that trust. And the hope is that without the kind of pressure cooker of the United States coming in with its ideas and plans, that the two sides will feel more capable of responding to this what I call a bottom-up effort to rebuild trust, to give the Palestinians greater ability to breathe, to operate their economy, to expand their cities and towns into Area C, where they're prevented from building these days, 60% of the West Bank. And in the process, create a more positive dynamic and hope that you'll get a different leadership out of it on both sides. In the meantime, Biden has made clear that he will oppose unilateral acts that serve to undermine the prospects for a two-state solution. So he's very aware that this process is not a substitute for a two-state solution, and that there's a real danger that in the meantime, the chances of a two-state solution will become even less rather than more because of actions on the ground, particularly, of course, settlement activity. So I think you're going to see a clear position against settlement activity because it fits in this with this general approach to trying to do whatever is possible to preserve the chances for a two-state solution in the future. Annexation has been taken off the table for the time being. The challenge is to take de facto annexation off the table.
Right.
And that's something that I think he will be focused on.
And historically, there has been, I mean, President Barack Obama famously in his first administration, one of the first things that he did was to announce a settlement freeze. And we know that that wasn't successful.
He didn't announce it, he called for it. It's a difference.
Right. Okay. Right. But I mean, it was considered among sort of many diplomats in the West a very provocative and bold move to move in this way. As you know, I spent a number of years, a different part of my life, advising the Palestinian leadership on negotiations. And so I was involved in the negotiations process at different times in a different capacity. But one of my takeaways from that was that, you know, of many takeaways, was one of the great failures was this failure to actually look at what was happening on the ground. And the facts on the ground were, you know, just as much, if not more, of a determinant of the prospect for peace, as much as sort of this diplomatic process, which I also see as absolutely necessary. But we don't have two equal parties here. One party controls the other. And as you know, also I'm Palestinian background and have a lot of family living in Bethlehem on the ground who, you know, for generations don't have basic fundamental rights, access to resources, the ability to move freely. And this situation is not static, it's continuing to evolve. So my question here is, we could have a whole set of questions around the facts of the ground, which are so problematic right now. But I'm trying to sort of like locate this within sort of larger movement internationally for this particular conversation. And what I mean by that is that now that after 4 years where many Israeli leaders, including the current Israeli prime minister and probably the next Israeli prime minister, have all but said in word and deed that there's never going to be a two-state solution. So now the US is not playing the same role, as I understand it, that we might have historically on the ground. We're seeing the growth in civil society movements such as BDS, for example, the International Criminal Court, which the US is not a party, but which has significant clout internationally, just asserted that it has jurisdiction over Israeli and Palestinian war crimes, whether committed by Israelis or Palestinians. So part of what I'm concerned about is sort of, you know, if we just sort of leave this out to the leadership equation on the ground when the situation on the ground is not static, is there really any hope of taking us to a place that might lead in authentic, credible, and fair negotiations that lead to a good result without addressing some of the very real systemic human rights violations that occur day to day on the ground?
Well, we will see. Human rights is an important part of Biden's foreign policy, if you accept my argument. And we'll see how it's applied in this case. The International Criminal Court raises an interesting dimension of this because while the Biden administration will support Israel when it comes to the issue of charging Israeli soldiers with war crimes, and we can go into that, but there are a whole lot of reasons why Biden will oppose that. There's a second dimension to the issues that the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court now has some jurisdiction over, according to the finding of the court. That's rejected by Israel, of course. But that other dimension is settlement activity,
right?
Which is very clearly part of her writ. and I assume she will pursue it. More likely to pursue that than the issue of bringing soldiers to indict soldiers on war crimes. Just because, well, there's a procedure in which, the country accused, if it can show that it has a robust judiciary and that these issues are addressed domestically, the court has basically decides not to get involved in that. But settlement activity is different. And settlement activity is something that, as I said, Biden opposes because he wants to preserve the two-state solution. So where Biden will come down on the question of ICC proceedings on settlement activity is a question that the Israeli government needs to ponder. Cannot know where that's going to go. And I think we'll see, but I think they will be unwise to test the proposition by more settlement activity. If they want Biden to help them with the larger issue, then maybe they need to help him. So we'll see. It will be interesting to see how it plays out. But inevitably, we're going to have a number of issues that will arise where Biden will have to decide what is his priority and what is it that he's going to insist on. I don't think he wants to get kind of wrapped around the settlement axle in the way that Obama did, that you referred to.
Well, maybe the ICC is a way of allowing this to happen at a little bit of not quite arm's length, but right. that is an interesting
a dynamic that he doesn't control when the United States is not a member of the ICC.
Well, and for many of our listeners, there's always been a little bit of a struggle over who kind of owns the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. In reality, the struggle hasn't been that great, but many European states over the years have wanted to play a more prominent role here and take a slightly different approach that was more internationalized and located within multinational organizations such as the United Nations and its bodies, which include the ICJ and the ICC, for example. And so this has always been something that has been lurking in really fascinating and interesting ways, but Europe has never sort of asserted itself or has been able to assert itself as a real driver here. So what Ambassador Indyk is highlighting, we don't know, this is all speculation. To me, is an interesting thought that this might be a place in which you may see different tracks emerge that we have not seen.
So here's a way of thinking about it. When Donald Trump was president for 4 years, the Europeans did nothing, squat. And I can remember conversation after conversation with diplomats from France, from Germany, from the UK, people, who want to play a role, and they were embarrassed that their governments were not prepared to do anything during the Trump era. Now, there's an opening for them because Biden is not going to try to push for negotiations. And the kinds of things that the Europeans can do well on the ground, for example, is the kind of things which he will welcome and encourage. So there's an opening for them, but it's not an opening to, try to create a new negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians, because their problem is that they don't have influence over Israel. You could say nobody has influence over Israel, but the United States has the best chance of influencing Israel because Israel is so dependent on the United States, whereas Europeans have no real ability to do that. And the Palestinians know that.
Right.
Why they want to re-engage with the United States. And I should have said, part of the process of of rebuilding is to rebuild the relationship between the United States and the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, which was destroyed by Trump's policies. Right. And that is going to move I think, quite quickly. We're likely to see a resumption of aid to UNRWA, perhaps as early as next week, resumption of aid to the Palestinians. And there's more money for the Palestinians. The Congress, in a bipartisan move last year, despite everything that Trump was doing to sanction and punish Palestinians, they voted more money, some $50 million a year for the next 5 years, on top of the aid that had already been allocated for these kinds of programs of development, supporting NGOs and people to people and relations and so on. So if Europe is going to partner in that process, you could make a difference on the ground by working together.
Now, I see that our chat box has been quite active during this conversation, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to read everything in detail. I'm going to turn to these questions in just a minute, and folks, my friends at Telos are helping me get to some of the questions that, so hopefully we won't miss out on anything. But I just want to draw off that last point and just explain a couple things and ask one last question before we transition to our audience questions. Just under President Trump's administration, there were a number of punitive acts taken against the Palestinian Authority for, it's described in calcitrance in relation to the peace process and what President Trump and his administration wanted to do. And there were a number of sort of quote unquote positive steps taken with respect to Israel. So funding was cut to the Palestinian Authority, funding was cut to UN agencies that administered to needy Palestinians, such as refugees. The PLO's diplomatic mission to DC was closed. And then meanwhile, as you know, sovereignty over the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem was recognized by the US, which was counter to international law and caused quite a large diplomatic uproar. The US embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which everyone had presumed would happen under a two-state solution. But the point was that the status of Jerusalem and this future status of Israelis and Palestinians had to be negotiated first. So that was quite controversial as well. Some of these moves are being quickly reversed by the Biden administration, such as the funding to the United Works and Reliefs Agency, which administers to Palestinian refugees. And it appears from statements from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken that some of these moves, like the US embassy move to Jerusalem, will not be reversed. But one development that I think is significant for our folks to highlight is the Partnership for Peace Act, which did pass with bipartisan consensus. Some people are quite positive about this and likening it to the fund for peace in Northern Ireland that was deemed as instrumental to actually creating the conditions to conclude the Good Friday Agreement there. And some are skeptical that this is not addressing the fundamental realities on the ground and actually dealing with human rights violations, particularly against Palestinians. So all of that to give a little bit of context. And now I'm just going to dive into some questions here, because one of the things that we want to be able to do is to gain some clarity for all of us on this call on how we use our time and our energies and our money in these next years, given a slightly different posture towards Israel-Palestine from this particular administration. But I'm going to begin with a couple questions from two people you may know. One is the Palestinian-American businessman Zahi Khoury, and he says that, do you think that an Israeli-Palestinian populist peace, European style, is of more value to Israel than normalization with the Gulf and Mali? Sort of trying to get at what's really in Israel's long-term interest here.
Thanks, Zahi. It's nice to know you're on the call. Can't see you, unfortunately. But it's a very good question. And I think that normalization is something that is actually a kind of normal transaction between states in the international system. It's not normal to deny recognition to a state member of the United Nations. But Israel had been denied that until the Egypt and Jordanian peace treaties, and it had established diplomatic relations with Egypt and Jordan in the process. And until the Oslo Accords came along, which, as Zaki will remember, opened the door to an Israel-Jordan peace treaty and then to a process of normalization with many Arab states in the Gulf and North Africa. And that normalization process was stopped in its tracks when the Intifada, the second Intifada, broke out, and relations were cut off. And that's when, in 2001, the Arab League, as a result of efforts by Saudi Arabia and Jordan, established the principle that there should be no normalization until there is the establishment of an independent Palestinian state based on the 67 lines, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living in peace with Israel. And that position held for 20 years. The Arabs held up their relations with Israel, waiting for the Israelis and the Palestinians to work out their deal. It's not surprising after 20 years, some of them got tired of that because their circumstances changed. And now Israel became important to them in a different way, particularly in terms of dealing with the threats that they faced from Iran, or they perceived from Turkey, or from the Muslim Brotherhood, or they identified Israel as a partner in their efforts to deal with this. And as the United States became more and more unreliable as their protector, they looked around and, they played with China, they played with Russia, but they knew that basically they couldn't rely on them. But Israel, because it faced similar threats and it was a capable regional power, maybe they could rely on Israel. And so they started to test that proposition. And they did not come to Israel and say, first of all, you've got to resolve the Palestinian problem. They came to Israel and talked about their threats, the common threats they faced. And that developed a whole new dimension to their relationships that was essentially done behind the backs of the Palestinians, if you like, but as their interests changed and this became more important in resolving the Palestinian problem, Palestinians were left by the wayside. And, every nation has a right to pursue its own interests. Even if it doesn't have the right, it will do that anyway. And so the Palestinians were left in the lurch. It's not as if there weren't plenty of indications that this was coming. And I do think that the Palestinian leadership failed its people in this regard, in trying to take advantage of the leverage that they had for 20 years while they still had it, rather than assuming that it was going to be there forever. There's a rather important piece by Ahmed Hawladi and Hussein Agha, two leading Palestinian intellectuals, in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs that I recommend that you read, because they are kind of very frank about the way in which Palestinian leadership needs to learn some lessons from what happened here. But we now face a new reality. And part of that reality is that Netanyahu can stand up and say, we got peace for peace. We didn't have to do anything for the Palestinians. Now, of course, he overlooks the fact that he had to agree to take annexation off the table, something that he had sworn that he was going to do, and is now committed to the UAE. For at least the next 3.5 years, there'll be no annexation. But Beyond that, when Bahrain did its normalization deal, or Morocco, or the Sudan, none of them conditioned it on anything to do with the Palestinians. And that has created this sense that Israel can have its normal, peaceful relations with the Arab world, and not have to worry about the Palestinians, which is not helpful in terms of trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, unless Palestinians learn a lesson from this and go back to taking their fate in their own hands and not waiting or depending on others to do it for them. Stop playing the victim and start playing the actor.
Well,
easy for me to say.
Yeah,
but it's they need to come to terms with what's happened here, because it's going to continue. And the big one here is Saudi Arabia, and they need to find a way to talk to the Saudis about what the Saudis will demand for normalization, because the dynamic that led the Emiratis to decide to normalize is very much there with the Saudis, even more so because they're in Biden's bad books. Normalization with Israel is some kind of get out of jail free card. But the Saudis are not like the Emiratis. They cannot, I would say will not normalize unless they can show that they protected the Palestinian rights in some way or other. And so the Palestinians should be in Riyadh now talking to them about what it is that they should want to have the Saudis tell Biden that it's going to be necessary if he wants the crown jewel of normalization, which is Saudi-Israel normalization.
I do think that's an important point, and I would personally agree, just based on my experience, that Palestinian leadership over many years could have been much more proactive in the way that they delivered the Palestinian message and acted strategically. And yet, like, having lived on the ground there and advised a leadership that lives in extremely difficult situation in which their personal safety is never an assurance and whatnot. It's a complicated reality, and I'm no defender of the leadership, but I remember thinking, like, what if you took members of U.S. Congress and put all of these restrictions, political? I mean, the idea that anyone could operate 100%, I think, is, and not that you would disagree with that, but is not entirely fair. But your point is,
that's totally fair, Greg. What you say is totally fair, but it doesn't excuse.
No, I agree 100%, and I think there have been so many missteps from the Palestinian leadership.
Are you telling me that Abu Mazen doesn't go and visit any Palestinian town, village, or city for decades because he's scared?
Or hasn't held any elections for since 2006, and I mean, there's much to go around, and I would join anyone in a lot of that criticism. So I'm not trying to say, I was just trying to add a little bit of context, actually, in something that you said about sort of the Palestinians always being left out, because regardless of what Palestinians do historically, I mean, we look back to the treaty, the first Camp David Accords with Egypt. The one sticking point between Egypt and Israel was the Palestinian question. And again, that was deferred. And it was by, Sadat agreeing to defer the Palestinian question that Begin and Carter and Sadat were able to conclude that accord.
Exactly.
Similarly with Jordan. And so what we've seen all of this activity all the way up to the Abraham Accords here, where the Palestinian issue is always kind of put on the back burner. And we even have diplomatics speak for this. There's this approach is called outside in, this idea that somehow if you deal with the issues around Israel, then somehow the Palestinian issue will get more difficult. I think many Palestinians feel as well, we see what the result is on the ground with the settlements, with our restrictions on movement keep increasing, our space keeps diminishing, whatnot. But I want to draw in a couple more questions in our last 15 minutes.
I just want to interrupt you, though, for one thing, because I don't think it's fair.
Okay.
What you said about Jordan. Everything else I agree with, but not what you said about Jordan. Jordan was, the ability to represent the interests of the Palestinians was taken away from Jordan and given to the PLO. PLO became the sole legitimate representative. That cut Jordan out of the game. But Jordan didn't move until the Palestinians made their agreement with Israel, the Oslo Accords. And it was only after that that the king moved, and he only looked after the Jordan piece of it, didn't try, because they said to him, we don't want you involved in our affairs. So I don't think Jordan deserves criticism here. And in fact, during the Trump years, the king was under huge pressure. This isn't commonly known, but he was under huge pressure to, quote, take the West Bank, with promises from Trump of cornucopia of assistance if he would only step in. And he refused. Right. And he supported the Palestinians despite the fact that his own aid was threatened. So, I just think we need to be careful to distinguish between some of the different players in the Arab world.
That's a fair retort. And I was not actually criticizing necessarily Egypt or Jordan in those particular instances. What I was trying to paint was through the larger trajectory, that the result for Palestinians always ends up the same, that they're on the back burner, that they're left out, no matter the intent of the other parties. But I completely take your criticism.
You see, it wasn't true. In Oslo, they were center stage. Now, you can say that the Oslo Accords were problematic and so on, but they were center stage. And they were center stage for a good, 10 to 15 years.
Right. But now we're at this place again, sort of, my point is just sort of that you're absolutely right on the Oslo Accords and the centering of sort of the Palestinian leadership and the recognition of the PLO, the establishment of the new Palestinian institution, the Palestinian Authority, which was the basis for a new state. So don't argue with that. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, the result from a Palestinian perspective always seems to land in the same place. That's not to absolve Palestinians of responsibility, whether the government or various factions have obviously made some disastrous and wrong choices over the years, and sometimes immoral and violent choices that were not defensible by any stretch of the imagination. But yet here we are today, where the potential for a just resolution and fair resolution of this conflict seems further than ever. That said, there are a couple more questions I want to get back to American involvement. However, I'm getting a lot of questions in my WhatsApp connected to sort of the solution, and one from Roni Kedar, who's in Nativ HaSara, which is an Israeli town just north of Sderot by the Israeli border, asking if maybe it's time to rethink of, at least entertain the possibility that there are other solutions for her and her neighbors in Gaza or the West Bank that focus on one state for two peoples. Or there was a recent New York Times op-ed arguing by Bernard Avishai and Sam Bahour, talking about a confederation, which is similar to two states, but a lot of institutions and governance would be shared in a confederation model. And I'm just wondering quickly, what are your thoughts on that? This goes against the historic orthodoxy of Oslo, that there is no solution but the two-state solution. But it seems that we have to really start considering that there may be other ways to approach this problem.
Definitely, we should always look for other ways. But we need to be realistic about that. I am part of that promoters of the orthodoxy that the other solutions that have been proposed, mainly one-state solutions, are not solutions. They're recipes for continuing the conflict. The only viable solution so far, and people have good reason to question the viability of it, but in the end, the only solution that makes sense, let me put it that way, is a two-state solution. And I strongly believe that. But the question then is, are there structures that you can develop that would make that two-state solution more viable? And there I thought that the Abu Shai-Bahur peace was important, because it introduced the idea of confederation. Now, traditionally, confederation has been talked about in the context of Palestinian state being established and then joining with Jordan in a confederation of a Palestinian state and a Jordanian state under the king. And the king has been prepared, the King Hussein and now King Abdullah have been prepared for that idea and to support that idea, as long as the Palestinian state is established first, before the confederation. Now you have this idea of confederation between a Palestinian state and Israel, and it's not a big leap of faith to talk about a confederation between Palestinian state, Israel, and the state of Jordan. And I think that somewhere there, in that framework, you could find a solution to a lot of the problems that have plagued the two-state solution up until now, in terms of the issues like Jerusalem, settlements, the security. I mean, basically all of them can be potentially more easily addressed in a circumstance where you kind of get out of that tight framework into a broader framework in which basic requirements, minimum requirements are met, but you can work out other arrangements that make the broader aspirations of the Palestinians in particular easier to address. So I do think it's important, particularly in this time when we're not going to have Israeli-Palestinian direct negotiations on final status issues. This is a time when other ideas can bloom and be developed, and I think that's an important part of the process.
Well, then maybe it might be good for another conversation at some point around this. At Telos, we're more about movement building than we are about sort of affecting specific or promoting or advocating for specific policies. But our view has always been that whatever solutions emerge, or whatever solution is proposed, such as a two-state solution or even a one-state solution, the ultimate measure will be how well it maximizes security, dignity, freedom for both Israelis and Palestinians. There can be any number of solutions which can fail on those counts, and those are not solutions at all. They're a continuation of the conflict. I have just a couple more questions. There's some just really wonderful questions in the chat, and I'm sorry that we're not getting to all of them, but we'll have many future conversations on the Telos webinar channel that we look forward to welcoming you back to. One is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I think it's really important for our audience. One person asks what the impact of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism might have if adopted by the Biden administration. Just a quick background, there's a new definition of anti-Semitism that's been circulating internationally, and it was gaining a lot of traction, and many interpretations seem to equate criticism of Israel, criticism of Zionism, of Israel as a nation state for the Jewish people, as anti-Semitic. And that is linked to a number of different potential repercussions for folks, whether they're in Europe, in Germany, or here in the United States. And so there's concerns among many in the activist community who are great fighters of anti-Semitism that this definition may be too narrow and in fact may severely chill advocacy on behalf of Palestinian human rights.
I think there's certainly that danger. I don't know what the Biden administration's position is going to be on this. Maybe they developed some position in the campaign, but I'm not aware of it. Are you? Do you know what their position was in the campaign?
Yeah, I should, and I can't cite it with authority.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they took a position, but in any case, if they have, that's important because you can see that they come to the party with well-developed ideas and an intention to implement them. So
Right.
we should check that. But I agree. This is one of these things that I do not believe helps the situation. And you know, there's a reality out there that some supporters of Israel have difficulty coming to terms with, because for so many years, decades, Israel was a country that was small, weak, dependent, and threatened by its neighbors. And a lot of people kind of grew up seeing the conflict in those terms, supporting Israel because it was an embattled state and its survival was in question. Now, especially after we have this normalization process, but also as a result of Israel's use of its own talent and the support it's had from the United States and Europe and elsewhere, it's built a strong, vibrant economy with the most powerful army in the Middle East and political relations with all of the world powers that are meaningful, and not just with the United States, which has Israel's back. So I think, that we need to kind of shift the lens and understand that Israel is a strong state, no longer a weak state. Bibi Netanyahu brags about how it's a world power. I don't think it's wise to have such a label, but that's what he says. And so, the idea that Israel is threatened and that we cannot all tolerate any criticism of Israel because it's somehow going to affect its ability to survive and the ability of the Jewish people to survive, I think misunderstands what the reality of the situation is. Israel still faces some real threats. The Iranians seem to get up every other day and want to destroy it, but it still, it has an ability to deal with these challenges in a way that it didn't have for much of its existence. So I think that's the lens that I tend to view things through.
I do think it's an important issue, and one of our listeners did put an article from Times of Israel saying that the Biden administration was encouraging adoption of the new IHRA definition. I encourage all of us to pay closer attention to this, as well as myself, obviously, that I should have been able to sort of talk about this issue with fluency, as it is an important issue, considering the dynamics there. And I would just add a slightly different lens to this. I think that it's important to recognize that anti-Semitism is on the rise and increasingly public, particularly within Western countries right now. This is a real thing. So Israel may be powerful, but the winds of anti-Semitism are blowing again, and they're blowing strong. And so it is something that all of us need to be aware of and need to resist. I, obviously am not Jewish, I'm Palestinian, and I think that many of the same opponents, of Palestinians at a very real sense are the same enemies of people who are Jewish and the Jewish people. And I think there's ultimately at its fundament, despite the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are some important alliances to be made across these lines, and casting people who advocate for fundamental human rights for Palestinians, just like any other people, including Israelis and Jewish people, as somehow anti-Semitic, serves to create and enforce those problematic barriers. I have one last question for you, where you've been so generous with your time, Ambassador Indyk. I noticed Fidel Abdel Hadi, who's the ambassador to the Deputy Permanent Observer Mission of Palestine at the United Nations, asked a lengthy question, which I'll paraphrase, so I hope I get it right. But the crux of it is that, Biden's foreign policy, freedom, democracy, human rights, these values are incredibly important. And what she's asking is, how can we who care about Israelis and Palestinians work to make sure that the Biden applies that values framework to Israel-Palestine. And just one sort of addendum from my perspective, I was speaking a couple years ago with one of your former colleagues, Senator George Mitchell, who was also special envoy to Middle East peace, about his work in Northern Ireland. He concluded the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And, you know, one of the questions was like, well, why did the US care about Northern Ireland? And he said, well, Irish Americans really cared about Ireland and Northern. And so they made a real sort of, they got organized and they made a stink about this particular issue. And such that this historic agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, which ended decades of, you know, the so-called Troubles, which most Irish see within a larger history of 800-year struggle between the Brits and the Irish. And so, so that's, I'd like to sort of end there. What can we do for those of us who really care about this issue, Israel-Palestine specifically, to ensure that the Biden administration abides by its stated foreign policy values on Israel-Palestine?
Well, you know, I think the door is open. And so advocacy can certainly help. But, you know, the challenges will be when the rubber hits the road, when there are actions on the ground by either side that raise questions about these fundamental principles that Joe Biden adheres to. We're going to come up with, you know, very quickly with those kinds of instances. We've got elections taking place in the Palestinian territories. You know, will East Jerusalemites be allowed to vote as provided for under the Oslo Accords? Will there be a free and fair election? Will Hamas and the Fatah decide to kind of divide up the spoils even before there's an election, which appears to be what's going on at the moment? We've discussed settlements and settlement activity, and that's going to be an ongoing issue, I believe. So there's going to be plenty of opportunities to advocate for the causes that many of your supporters believe in. But there's also going to be an opportunity to build relationships between Israelis and Palestinians. And there's going to be funding for that. And NGOs, I'm not sure that it's Telos's mission, but NGOs will have the ability to get funding to promote Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation committee and so on. And that's very important in the process. So, you know, I think that people who may be disappointed that we're not going to have a push to a final agreement tomorrow, and that this will somehow resolve all the problems, I think should just recognize that it's not going to happen that way. And it's not just because Joe Biden doesn't believe it can be done. It's because there are fundamental problems on the ground that make it really difficult to get there from here. And so if you really care about that, as I'm sure everybody here does, then you've got to look for other ways to, on the one hand, protect the rights of individuals and communities, and on the other hand, try to build trust between these communities. And that's a big enough challenge for all of us.
Well, I want to thank you, Ambassador, for your incredible insights and wisdom. I know I've learned a lot from this conversation personally, and I hope our community has as well, as we consider how to steward our resources going forward and where to put our energies. I do believe that we all as Americans have a fundamental role to play here. As we know, there are fellow groups of our Americans who are pushing quite forcefully for a different approach and different results. And they succeeded during the last 4 years. for example, and may still have some impact during these 4 years. So one of the dynamics on the ground here that we can influence is how we talk about these issues within our own communities. And so this work is fundamentally important to creating not just the motivation for different approach to Israel-Palestine, but also for shifting ultimately the reality on the ground there. So I just want to encourage all of you. Thank you for joining in. Please keep your questions coming. I want to thank David and Sharon, and also encourage you to join us next Thursday. We have another webinar with Rabbi Melissa Weintraub from Resetting the Table. This is focused on the difficult divisions that we have within our own communities across the country right now, and not Israel-Palestine specific. But in our mind, there is a connection here. We have to learn how to engage people from different backgrounds within a values framework. They're going to screen a short film, 20 minutes, called Purple. I guarantee you this will be eye-opening to many of you, and also provide a variety of opportunities to learn some skills to rethink how we engage the so-called other domestically here at home. In coming weeks, we're going to have a webinar with Palestinian business leaders to hear what their perspective is from the ground. We're also having a series on evangelicals and Israel-Palestine, which will be a set of webinars that's coming up. As well as a series on the weaponization of faith. So there's a lot of good content coming in the pipeline. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter if you're not there already. And I also encourage you, this doesn't happen for free. So if you are inclined to make a donation to help continue this content, we'd very much appreciate it. Thank you all, especially to you, Ambassador Indyk. This was a wonderful, wonderful time.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks very much for having me, and stay safe and warm, everybody.